we still have political analyst Brian Sobel on with us for some analysis as we continue to weave through these speeches that we're getting here at Live Now from Fox. But Brian, thank you so much for sticking with us.
My pleasure, and these speeches are interesting. I followed Bass's speech with interest, and of course Tom Steyer's.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask you about, of course, these races haven't been called yet, but I was curious about, someone's going to replace Governor Gavin Newsom, but he's been pretty quiet in any endorsement of any of the candidates in this race. Why wouldn't the California governor endorse anyone to replace him?
Because he intends to run for president, Alexandra, in 2028, and he wants all of these people that are in this race for governor to endorse him. And you don't get endorsements when you've endorsed one over several others. So he took the political decision to not get involved in the race, and basically at one point said, well, they're all my friends. And so from his standpoint, if you're going to run for president and you need all these people, probably not a good thing to pick one out of that group.
Understood. I want to bring up those early indications of the numbers that we have once again here, Brian. Xavier Becerra and Steve Hilton are pretty neck and neck at about 27% of the vote. This has been such a dense field of candidates, with Becerra emerging as the Democratic frontrunner not too long ago. Brian, what factors could you attribute to this? Was Becerra the beneficiary of Eric Swalwell dropping his bid for governor because of sexual assault allegations? Talk to us about some of those factors.
That's exactly what happened. I think the majority of people who were supporting Swalwell, Eric Swalwell, when he dropped out of the race, decided that Xavier Becerra would be their choice. And as I've pointed out nationally, regionally, and locally in various interviews, the thing that Xavier Becerra benefits from is that his the poll numbers and favorabilities are interesting to look at. He has not a great favorable rating. It's almost one of these things where people don't know him well enough to know the difference, but his unfavorables are very, very low. Now, you contrast that with a Steyer, where you either like him or you dislike him, and then people know where they are on the scale with a Steyer. Same with Katie Porter, another good example of you like him or you don't like him, or her, and that's and so Becerra benefited from a lot of people not really knowing him, and what they heard about him was, not a whole lot of substance, as it were, and he benefited from that. And so tonight we see that he'll end up as the quite likely as the number one or number two choice of voters in this jungle primary, as you've alluded to earlier, who will move on to November. Interestingly, this is breaking down, without pretending to be too prescient, exactly as I called it. It was becoming very clear in the last 2 or 3 weeks how this race was shaping up. Chad Bianco was fading. A lot of the Republicans were going to shift their votes over to Steve Hilton. Tom Steyer got to a certain point and just couldn't advance anymore. His campaign just, in a sense, stalled at about where it is right now. And I find his remarks interesting, without piling on, that he cites billionaires and other people as the problem in the election. Well, he's a billionaire. And I think through this campaign, a lot of people watched him position himself as, Alexandra, what I would call a good billionaire. All these other people were bad billionaires, but he's a good billionaire. And then he dumps a couple $100 million into the race because he has it, and then blames everybody else for spending money. People see through that. And I think he did not benefit from a lot of these remarks along the way, where he tried to paint billionaires collectively as all bad people, but he was the good billionaire, and a number of other things as well.
Steyer with that record amount of spending in this race. Brian, if you will take a couple steps back with me, I think this is important for our viewers to know as election days happen. I'm curious about voter turnout, enthusiasm for these races. What's your pulse on voter turnout? Higher, lower, about the same as recent elections? What do you think?
I think it's going to come in on the lower side of things. It's a primary that in California, not this is not everywhere, but well, I could say nationally it's down. It'll be down and was down, but in California, for example, you always look at what is the race at the top of the ticket, and in California, for your viewers, it's the governor's race, but the governor's race didn't catch fire. People just weren't that interested in it, and thought that the candidates were not interesting in each body, as it were. So, from that perspective, voter turnout is always tamped down because people say, you know, whatever's going to happen is going to happen, and I'll catch up with the results. And it's a primary. I think you'll see a much bigger turnout in the general, like on the order of 70%, something like that, when all these races have been decided tonight, and now everybody knows who the candidates are that will face off in November, and I think that's where you're going to see a much higher voter turnout.
26.1 million Californians are of voting age. Wanted to mention that statistic that I found earlier today. Of course, we have early indications of who is leading as these ballots are being counted, but could take a little bit to get those final results. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Some of these races around California may take days, maybe even weeks to solve, and that's not unusual. I know it chaps the hide of certain people who watch elections and think that these ought to be instantaneous, but they're not. You know, ballots come in late; they deserve to be counted, and so this elongates the process of deciding who will win. Now, it's also true that you can look at certain percentages and what votes are outstanding. And Alexandra, you know that the numbers aren't going to change that much. I mean, we don't have time tonight to get into the math of it, but oftentimes people like me take a look at it and we can call something very early because you just know mathematically there isn't a way to find 3-to-1 votes for a candidate or 4-to-1 for a candidate so that candidate can catch up. It doesn't work that way. So if these percentages are 5, 6, 7 points, say in the California gubernatorial race, that's pretty much a done deal.
Well, we have a lot more to discuss. I want to get into LA mayor and some of these U.S. House races in just a moment. Brian, what I'm going to have us do, I'm going to take a quick 2-minute commercial break, and then we will discuss the rest.
That's fine. Yep.
Welcome back to Live Now from Fox. Political analyst Brian Sobel has been standing by for us this evening, continuing to talk about these California primary races. Let's bring him in for some more analysis. Brian, we have been talking about the California governor's race. I want to pivot to Los Angeles County now, that hot seat for mayor. We have played out a couple of speeches. Mayor Bass talking in Koreatown, Nifia Rahman also talking before the race has been called. But Brian, let's zero in on some of the issues here. Angelenos consistently cite homelessness as a top issue. How do the three differ on their policy approaches to homelessness, and what do you think resonated with voters?
Well, I think for the mayor, I think she has talked about finding housing for homeless individuals on a large scale. Rahman, the city council member, is a very, very liberal, progressive, just to understand her politics. And you heard in her speech, it's about more trees, it's about, loving people more and a bunch of these other things. And frankly, her message around homelessness and other things just is not reality-based, and that's a problem. And so then you have Spencer Pratt, whose opinion is that homelessness needs to be cleaned up through more effective crime prevention and those sorts of things. So their positions, Alexandra, really contrast. And as this race moves towards November, you're going to see these two top finalists, Bass and Pratt, put all these positions on display for Angelenos. And those who vote in Los Angeles are going to get a real contrast between the incumbent mayor and this newcomer who started out without a whole lot of polling moving in his direction, and tonight has done very, very well.
And you just saw there on your screen, again, the latest numbers that we have from the Associated Press. Bass at about 37% of the vote, Pratt at 30%, Nithya Raman in third place there. I do want to pivot, Brian, and talk about some of these U.S. House races. Of course, California has redrawn their congressional maps. I do want to ask you about that if we have the chance. But first, what U.S. House races are you watching? What are you waiting to see play out?
Well, mostly I'm looking at some of the California House races, particularly the ones where that portend redistricting changes coming. We, as you know, in Texas and in California, the lines were redrawn, and the question will be, are the races that reflect the redrawn districts, which will come over time, do they go to the Republicans or Democrats that were redrawn in the favor of that party? And so that's going to be interesting to watch over time, because one of the things I've always pointed out is you can redraw a district, and that has a profound impact on a race, because it changes the demography. But the person who's running in that district still has to convince the voters that they're somebody to vote for it. And it's whether it's a Republican in Texas or California and Texas, they still have to make their case. So there are all kinds of races. Most of them are very predictable because California is very, very blue. And so we'll see, especially after tonight, how this shakes out. It's a little too early to speak authoritatively on what the outcome is of a lot of this.
And we're keeping our eye on a lot of those outcomes. California Democrats hoping to pick up 5 Democratic seats during the midterm elections in November. Brian Sobel, political analyst, we appreciate you staying on top of all of this for us here at Live Now from Fox. Appreciate your insight and analysis as always.
My pleasure. I know we'll be chatting again soon.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks for coming on.